Hi there, I'm Jason DeYoung and thanks for tuning in to my YouTube channel. For most of my adult life, I've been a deer hunter. I love the taste of venison, and pretty much all of the meat my family and I eat comes from the animals we hunt. The time I spend hunting allows me to study how my food lives, and I'm thankful that I get to experience a wide range of powerful emotions while I do it. I love that I get to feel the happiness of procuring meat for my family, but this is balanced with the profound sadness that comes with the first-hand understanding that to be a meat eater means the death of a beautiful animal like this mule deer doe. Another big game season has come and gone here in Alberta, and I'm thrilled to invite you to come along with me, my shotgun, and my camera as we set out to fill my freezer using a specialty lead-free 12-gauge shotgun round. Branded Hog Wild by Oregon-based ammunition manufacturer Hevi-Shot, these 3-inch 12-gauge shells comprise a payload of two 62 caliber cast zinc balls packaged in a somewhat unique wad and spacer configuration that keeps the balls from touching one another and prevents deformation upon firing. Here's the two Hevi-Shot zinc balls compared to a 1-ounce 12-gauge Foster slug and a load of double-aught copper-plated buckshot. The buckshot pellets have a diameter of 32 caliber, and the Foster slug measures out at approximately 72 caliber. When compared to the Foster slug, the Hevi-Shot spheres don't look that far off, but because they're made from zinc instead of lead, there's a big difference in their density and consequently their mass and sectional density. Put to the scale, the 72 caliber rifled lead slug weighs 437 grains, or just about an ounce. By comparison, each 62 caliber zinc ball weighs in at just 205 grains, and the two combined only make up about 95% of the mass of the single Foster slug. But while zinc is most certainly less dense than lead, it is quite a bit harder, and I was curious to test out what this trade-off might mean with respect to some of the load's ballistic characteristics. With some experimentation, I determined that through the modified choke of my shotgun out to about 50 yards, the spheres patterned surprisingly tightly, and that within that range, they both penetrated well and were subject to a surprising degree of plastic deformation. Fired from a distance of about 15 yards, these balls hit within a half inch of each other, penetrated about 38 inches of water, and underwent significant deformation as they passed through their terminal medium. Backing up to 30 yards, their pattern had opened up to about 3 inches. There was slightly less deformation, yet surprisingly better penetration by at least several inches. And at 45 yards, the spheres were hitting about 10 inches apart, exhibiting almost no deformation and penetrating about 36 inches of water. Not much beyond 45 yards, I felt like the pattern was too open for ethical deer hunting, so I self-imposed my effective limit at 50 yards. Making clean kills on the deer I take is really important to me, so I vowed that if I was unable to close the distance to within the limits suggested by my summer tests, the only ethical outcome would be to let a prospective deer go. This happened a couple of times throughout my hunting season, and while super frustrating to see that white tail flag back and forth as she runs away, it makes me happy knowing that I have enough self-control to hunt within the limits of my skill and equipment. But before we get to how my freezer got to be so full, I'd love to share with you one of my favorite recipes, venison meatloaf. Ground venison, rolled oats, breadcrumbs, eggs, chopped onion, parsley, and garlic, a little bit of ground thyme, mixed all together, then into the loaf pan with some ketchup and brown sugar as a sauce on top and bottom, then into the oven at 350 for an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. Served hot with some steamed sweet peas and a super icy sparkling water, it's one of my favorite meals of all time. I can't wait, so let's go hunting. To start out my season, I'd found a little clump of bush along the edge of a field owned by a cattle rancher who used it to grow green feed for his cows. After securing permission, I scouted out a location where it seemed like a ton of deer were crossing a couple of barbed wire fences that separated the field from their daybeds just off in the woods. I set myself up along the edge of the field with a good view of the crossing and was soon rewarded with deer coming out of the woods to feed. I was pretty pumped as this little white-tailed buck crossed the final fence into the field where I was sitting, and my excitement grew quickly as he began to make his way along the edge of the field towards me. By the standards of a trophy hunter, he's not that great a buck at all, but as I'm a meat hunter on a mission to fill my freezer, Bighorns aren't nearly as interesting to me as good eating, so as he saw me and stopped at a distance of about 35 yards, I had no hesitation in deciding to shoot him. I pulled the camera back to catch a wide perspective of the shot, settled in behind my shotgun, and carefully took up the trigger. He shuddered with the shot, stumbled down, then sprung up and ran about 50 yards before falling over. I waited a good 10 minutes, then slowly began my approach to the fallen deer with gun ready in case he jumped up to go for another big run. As I closed the final few yards towards him, I was pretty sure he was dead, but the eyeball test removed any lingering doubts. My first Hevi-Shot HOG wild deer was dead. After peeling his hide off, I used these pieces of rebar to trace the path of the two zinc spheres through his body. The buck had been 3/4 facing me when I shot him, and the pellets hit about 4 inches apart around his left front shoulder. They transited his thoracic cavity, puncturing both lungs and the heart before piercing his diaphragm. Both spheres then traveled through his liver and continued rearwards through his digestive viscera. One of the spheres then exited around his mid-right abdomen, and I recovered the other sphere along the back of his abdominal cavity just forward of his pelvis. Here's the recovered sphere. While showing slight deformation, it's less than what I was expecting based on my water tub tests, but it did travel the whole length of the deer in a reasonably straight line to make a clean kill, so I can say I'm satisfied with my first experience. One deer, though, is not enough to feed my family for a year, so back out I went with my shotgun the next afternoon. My only problem was that the lone visitor this evening was another small whitetail buck. Being allowed just one antlered whitetail each season, I had to be happy sitting back and watching while he ate his fill and slipped back into the trees. The following afternoon, a wall of weather moved through. It started out with a drastic change in wind direction, a drop in temperature, and a strangely beautiful but heavy hoarfrost. There was not a deer to be seen anywhere, and I imagine they were all in their beds waiting out the front. Fresh snow fell overnight, but a clear sky the following morning had me excited to get out and see if the deer were moving around. I took a morning walk to use the fresh snow to get an idea of how the deer were traveling, and was soon rewarded with this lone doe. I tried to be all stealthy and sneak up behind the tractor shed, but the snow made for crunchy footsteps, and even before I cleared the side of the shed, she was looking back. It was now or never. At the shot, she had immediately collapsed, thrashed for a couple of seconds, but then fell still. After waiting a couple more minutes, carefully watching the tall grass behind a loaded gun, there were no more signs of movement, so I got up and began my cautious approach to the fallen deer. As I moved in for the eyeball test, my stomach went tight as she was still breathing and making an effort to move. I don't know why it's still hard for me to do that, but it is, and I wished I'd done a better job on the first shot. Getting her home and peeling off her hide, it became evident what had happened. Both zinc spheres had hit her, about 8 inches apart and about 4 inches higher than what I would have liked for ideal shot placement. They'd both missed her heart and lungs, instead breaking her spine in 2 places. Even after breaking a large amount of bone, the spheres had sufficient energy to keep going and both exited the backside of the doe. While it was not the one-shot quick kill I always strive for, the outcome was still a recovered deer that died reasonably quickly, so I headed back out to try and fill one more tag. Winter was definitely coming, and on an overcast afternoon with gently falling snow, I'd managed to successfully play the wind and crawl up within easy shooting distance to a couple of mule deer. As I set the camera up and started to watch them a bit more closely, though, it became clear that the deer were mother and fawn. And while browsing, the fawn was still occasionally looking to feed from mum. I suspect this is why the fawn looked so fat and why mum looked a little skinny. I resolved not to shoot and enjoyed watching the fawn become aware of my presence. The little one snorted and stomped a bit, then trotted off with mum in tow. I sometimes wonder, though, if bringing along my camera divides my focus sufficiently that I make mistakes. As an example, I'll offer my last deer of the season. I'd spotted some traveling whitetail from afar, requiring me to run quickly about 1 kilometer to put myself just in front of where I thought they wanted to go. I rushed to set up the camera just as they were coming to the tree line, and as this doe stopped, I fumbled to pull back the lens and then get into a good shooting position. As the steer broke, I knew it was a bad shot, having pulled slightly to the left as a result of poor breath control. Almost certainly my shot had hit her back a bit. She winced, turned around, and ran full tilt back the other way as I reloaded my gun, put the bead just off her front chest, matched speed, and fired again. With all these trees in the way, it was something of a miracle that both balls hit her solid, and never in my life have I been so relieved as to walk up to a dead deer. I was astounded that my shot on the running deer had connected, and while super thankful it had the focus to hit, I couldn't help but wonder if I would have been more careful in the first place had I left the camera at home. My season now over, I sat with her a bit to think while I watched the sunset, then took her back home to get her hide off and her meat in the freezer. After getting her hung and early into the skinning process, I recovered the 2 spheres from my first shot just under the skin of her backside hamstring. They had entered just at the transition between her thoracic and abdominal cavities, one sphere having damaged the back lobe of a lung as well as her liver, while the other sphere hit her in the stomach. They traveled the length of the deer before becoming lodged in the offside hamstring just under the skin, and while the first shot probably would have been lethal, the tracking job would have been long with a high probability of not finding her. Taken while she was on the run, my second shot hit her squarely in the boiler room, transiting both lungs but was just a hair too far back to hit her in the heart. Both spheres exited her far side, and I'm convinced this shot was the one that killed her quickly. While a little upset with myself for taking the first raking shot, I'm very thankful I took the second one, as it bothers me deeply to imagine her being half-eaten by coyotes before dying in the middle of the night. Here's the 2 recovered spheres from my first shot, which took place at a distance of approximately 40 yards. There was little deformation, which is consistent with my summer test results. I have to wonder, though, what my first shot would have been like if I had been using slugs. Would it have been completely in her abdomen, or would it have been a little more forwards? This makes me wonder if having 2 projectiles with each shot is something of an advantage, or if I'm just rationalizing my poor shot on my season's ending doe. So that pretty much wraps up my 2016 hunting season using Hevi-Shot's Hog Wild Zinc Sphere duplex load. Would I use it again? With some careful preseason practice and a resulting 50-yard maximum effective range, I think it's not a bad round, and I appreciate that it creates 2 wound tracks per shot within the limits of my effective range. Thanks so much for coming with me. I really hope you'll subscribe so I can bring you along next year when I go deer hunting again. Cheers, and thanks for watching.